Hi, everybody. Thanks, and thanks for the patience. I promised to talk for exactly 14 minutes and 54 seconds. Okay, so my task in rounding this out, I was originally going to talk exclusively about the Migrant Caravan. And the reason that we wanted to focus on this is because we're no different than the general public, and we focus on the things that are spectacular. We being academic researchers. And that's also something that focuses a lot of political concern and focuses a lot of journalistic concern, is this spectacular aspect of people walking across borders uninvited. But the bigger picture of what I want to get at by talking about that, and I think all of us mostly rewrote our presentations over the last few days because everything's changing so quickly, it seems. But I want to talk about the broader aspect of how US policy change and being a small country living beside a big and influential neighbor can affect policy and politics in Canada as well. And also, I guess, I don't really have an answer for this, but how we can weather the storm for the next 2 years and God help us, maybe more years after that. Is it the green button? Yeah, okay. So I want to set the stage by talking about why the Migrant Caravan, and I'm assuming people have seen and know about the Migrant Caravan, why it exists in the first place. So this is a small group of people, several thousand people that have made their way from Honduras through Guatemala to Mexico, and now a large part of them are on the border, the US-Mexico border in Tijuana, and by some accounts dispersing. They come from an area we call the NTCA, the Northern Triangle of Central America, which are predominantly 3 countries, Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador. People coming from this region into Mexico and the US is nothing new. But the region is experiencing a massive and growing displacement crisis. It's seen a 10-fold increase in the number of refugees and asylum seekers over the past decade, with an estimated 180,000 people displaced in neighboring countries. Over 350,000 people from the region have claimed asylum globally from 2011 to 2017. And I had graphs, but I took them out because the slideshow was too long. But if you can imagine a graph, of that 350,000 people, 130,500 made asylum claims in 2017 alone. So that would be a huge uptick over time. Most of them are going to Mexico and the US, but an increasing number are in Belize and Costa Rica and Panama, so claiming asylum around the region. And added to this, and something that isn't focused on, there's a massive number of internally displaced people in the region, so IDPs. So the closest estimates are 715,000 IDPs in the region, but governments there don't want to focus on that issue. And some scholars say that it might be twice as high. And the people in the region, the type of displacement there is unique. One aspect of it is that people on average are displaced twice. So they've been displaced a couple of times. But it also has the world's most urbanized refugee or displaced population, whether that's IDPs or refugees. It has a 95% urbanized displaced population, which makes standard humanitarian aid, so camp-based humanitarian aid, very difficult because it's hard to disaggregate the populations. And even these kind of new plans that we have through the Global Refugee Compact for using development-type aid, that will also be increasingly difficult with urbanized populations. So added to the fact that the states in the region are notoriously corrupt and inefficient as well. So why is this happening? A lot of reasons, and there's poverty, there's corruption, there's gender-based and gender-based discrimination and violence, and violence based on people's sexual and gender orientations. But the violence in the region is staggering. So the Latin America and the Caribbean has 8% of the world's population, but 33% of global homicides happen there. And it's really staggering, to put this in perspective. So if you look at the number for El Salvador, that's aggregated by gender. If you disaggregate it by gender, for men in El Salvador, it's 97 in 100,000 homicide rate. So you have a 1 in 1,000 chance of being murdered as a young man, predominantly because of gangs in El Salvador. To put that in perspective for Canada, it's 1.7 in 100,000, right? If we think about how staggering that is, and it has real effects on states, this type of violence. So the Global Peace Index estimated that El Salvador lost 49% of its GDP in 2017 because of this type of violence. That makes it the fourth worst affected country, which is on par with South Sudan, and then behind only Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Right? So this is a displacement crisis that's happening in Central America, in our hemisphere, and this is the reason that the caravan exists. I mean, added to this is a whole lot of reasons around ecological degradation and climate change. People are also displaced off their land for mining, for palm oil. Canadian companies, Bay Street, which funds the, how do you go back? If you look at my tagline on the bottom there. Canadian companies are very well represented in resource extraction in these regions. And indigenous populations are increasingly pushed off their land. There's also major ecological pressures from drought and lack of agricultural productivity. So the countries in this region have lost something like 220,000 hectares of agricultural land over the last decade, leading to something that they call the dry corridor, which is basically an area of ecological destruction from the south of Mexico all the way down to Panama, which, what's the figure? That 2.2 million people in the region are at risk of food insecurity because of this dry corridor and these ecological changes. So that's the reason that the caravan exists, despite what we might hear from this orange fella. He looks actually better than he usually does in this picture. I should have chose. Trust me, he looks worse. Okay. Did you guys see the umbrella video when he was getting on the plane? What a fucking idiot. Okay. So that sets the stage for the caravan. What I want to note is that these big changes in U.S. policy and political messaging affect the way that the caravan is being received by populations, but also by authorities. So I study the international politics of irregular migration, and here we look at a lot of the knock-on effects of state policies on irregular migration systems, but also on forcing other states to make policy changes as a result of your policy changes and the knock-on effects that kind of cascade down through systems. So in some cases, states can try to engineer mass migration to coerce their neighbors. So they threaten mass migration to get neighbors to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do. And otherwise, they can compel other states with incentives. So this mix of coercion and compelling states is something that the EU and European states are really good at, and that they've been practicing for a few decades, or a couple decades rather. And right now, we demonstrably see that the U.S. leveraging Mexico until the current administration leaves to try to be hard on the migrants down at the southern border with Guatemala. And I mean, I can talk about this more, but this is like policy that you see diffusing, these types of options diffusing largely from Europe, who are the kind of leaders on this, to North America. And in other cases, which are much more common, states just make policy choices that create what they call beggar thy neighbor dynamics. So they make a policy choice thinking of America first, and then that starts cascading down a system and forces other states to make choices. And it's not just that states do this with other states that they don't like. We see this longtime allies doing this with one another. You saw European states doing this in the 2015 refugee crisis, and still doing it today. If you look at the borders between, for instance, Italy and France, or Italy and Austria. And there's also the fact that now that the migrant caravan is reaching Tijuana, you see the fact that the U.S. policy change, which is to basically close the border there, is trapping the caravan in Tijuana, which is creating social tensions with people there who need to go back and forth over the border on a daily basis, but already have this really tenuous relationship with the border and with U.S. immigration authorities. And so there now we're starting to see the same rhetoric that the migrants are dirty, that they're criminals, that they're carrying diseases. And this protest last week saying that they don't want to integrate, even though they've been there for 2 days. But where this language comes from, it's not as if the people in Tijuana developed this language on their own in a 2-day period. Another aspect of this is historical. So what we're seeing is this really kind of like perverse historical reckoning with the caravan, because the violence in the NTCA countries is in a large part caused by the deportation of gang members from the US from previous administrations. So anyway, I can't preview. Yeah, I'm gonna skip ahead. What's especially troubling for me is that it doesn't matter if the flow is small, and it doesn't matter if the people in the flow aren't criminals, and we know for a fact that facts don't matter when it comes to public opinion and asylum, which is something that's really scary. So if we look at the effect on Canada, my new favorite Twitter account, it's already having these political and social impacts in Canada. I'm glad I don't need to talk about this, but looking ahead at the 2019 federal election. So what's the total number here? So in 2019, the Trump administration is going to repeal temporary protected status for 425 people. 80% of those people are from El Salvador and Honduras. When the Trump administration repeals temporary protected status, people will have a few choices, right? You can stay where you are and kind of go underground, but given the militarization of ICE raids, that's going to be dangerous. You can move to a sanctuary jurisdiction inside the US. You can go back to your country of origin, but as we've seen, the countries of origin that we're talking about are not viable places for people to return to, and many of them don't even have a connection to those places in the first place because they've been in the US for a long time. Or you can seek refuge in a third country. That's what we see with the regular asylum seekers coming over the border into Canada. So that last step, we're not sure how many people will come. It's hard to do the kind of research that tells you about people's potential future choices given different choice matrices. But even if only 10%, so that's the number of Haitians that decided to come to Canada out of the US population when they ended TPS for Haitians, if only 10% of people, if only 10% of Salvadorans decided to come to Canada, that would be a 100% increase in asylum claims in Canada, coinciding directly with the federal election, when you already have people like what do we call her, the honorable? The right honorable? No, something? The honorable? No, she's got the on, doesn't she? No? Okay, good. Just Michelle Rempel. Anyway, you get my point. The situation's already politicized, and we have these confluence of trends coming down the pipe, where we could start seeing our own caravans in Canada. The other aspect of it is that we're already seeing this narrative now of again, just mimicking Austria, Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic, Romania, now Australia, and Israel. Here's Michelle Rempel retweeting Bibi. No migrants go to Israel. They had some, anyway. Nobody's showing up at the Israeli border anymore. So this discursive connection between irregular migration crisis, global governance, and not signing the migration compact, which will be signed in December 10th and 11th of this year, but just creating this issue. And then there's also the fact that sorry, I'm gonna go back. Don't look at that. There's also the fact that half of the people that have TPS have mixed households. So 50% of TPS recipients lived in mixed households with American citizen spouses or American citizen children. And now we're seeing this narrative in Canada of 6,000 Americans claimed asylum in Canada last year or something like that. It's not that Americans are showing up here as like war resistors or something along those lines. They're coming from mixed households with people that have likely feel a lot of threat in the US and have genuine claims for asylum in Canada. How the policy is going to deal with that, I guess we're going to have to see. I wanted to end with this slide. This is my grandmother. The child on the beautiful little girl on your left, she died 2 days ago in Ottawa at the age of 97 years old. So the reason I want to show you this picture comes from their exit passport from the Kingdom of Hungary. They left the Kingdom of Hungary in the interwar years, which was a really confusing time in a messy place. They were maybe Roma. They were probably Roma. They were maybe Jews or, just Magyar blood. My grandma always said, "We're not gypsies," which made me think that they were definitely gypsies. No one's really sure. There's a bunch of apocryphal stories about gold and a horse kicking someone and an evil stepmother. It's real. It's not quite clear, but what is clear is that they were refused. The trip across Europe was hard. They were refused entry to the U.S., so they got on a boat and came to Canada uninvited. And showed up in Canada, and what else is sure is that 2 generations later, I'm standing on a stage talking about this, and that next week at this time, basically, I have an invitation to go to speak in front of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Immigration about the Migration Compact, so I get to show this picture to Michelle Rempel. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to end there. Thank you. Thanks.